The stars had never looked so threatening.
Admiral Helena Vasquez stood at the observation deck of the UES Prometheus, her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she stared into the void that had become humanity's cage. Beyond the reinforced glass, stretching in every direction until they blotted out the familiar constellations of her childhood, hung the alien armada.
17,000 vessels. The count had been confirmed 6 hours ago, and it hadn't changed since. They hung in perfect geometric formation, a sphere of death that encompassed Earth at a distance of roughly 300,000 kilometers, just beyond lunar orbit. The moon itself had become a reference point for the enemy's positioning, their ships arranged in patterns that spoke of mathematical precision and cold, calculating intelligence. The Cathari had arrived without warning, without preamble, without the diplomatic overtures that humanity's science fiction writers had imagined for centuries. One moment, Earth's skies had been empty, save for the usual satellite traffic and the occasional commercial spacecraft. The next, reality itself had seemed to tear open in 17,000 simultaneous wounds, disgorging the fleet that now held humanity hostage. That had been 48 hours ago. 48 hours of silence, of humanity scrambling to organize a response, of world governments that had spent decades squabbling over resources suddenly finding common cause in the face of extinction.
"Admiral," a voice called from behind her. Commander James Chen, her executive officer, approached with the measured steps of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have. "The final tallies are in from Earth Command."
Helena didn't turn from the viewport. "Tell me." Combined military assets across all nations, 347 combat-capable vessels, ranging from the carrier classes down to patrol corvettes. Another 200 civilian ships that could theoretically be converted for combat use, though most of those are cargo haulers with about as much armor as a paper bag. And our ground-based defenses? 12 orbital defense platforms, all originally designed for asteroid interdiction. 800 surface-to-space missile installations spread across 32 nations. Approximately 4,000 atmospheric combat aircraft that could provide support in near-orbit engagements. Chen paused, and Helena could hear him swallowing. "Ma'am, even if we count every asset we have, we're outnumbered roughly 30 to 1. "I can do math, Commander." Helena finally turned, and Chen was struck, as he often was, by the calm in her gray eyes. She was 64 years old, had served in 3 wars and a dozen police actions, and had seen humanity at both its worst and its best. Nothing in those eyes suggested she was ready to see it end. "What about the message?" "Still transmitting on all frequencies. Dr. Morrison's linguistics team has translated it as best they can." Chen handed her a tablet, though she didn't need to read it again. The words had been burned into her memory from the first briefing. "You are contained. Your development has been observed. Your potential has been calculated. You will be harvested. Resistance will increase efficiency of harvest. We encourage resistance." The last 2 sentences were what haunted humanity's leaders. Not a warning against fighting back, but an invitation, an encouragement. As if the Cathari wanted humanity to struggle, to make the harvest more efficient by some metric that no human could understand. "Any response to our attempts at communication?" Helena asked, though she already knew the answer.
"None. They acknowledge receipt of our transmissions but provide no meaningful response. Dr. Morrison believes they understand us perfectly well. They simply don't care what we have to say."
Helena nodded slowly, returning her gaze to the alien fleet. In the distance, she could see the closest vessels with her naked eye, vast, angular constructs that seemed to have been designed without any consideration for aesthetics. They were weapons, pure and simple, tools built for a single purpose. "Commander, what time is the emergency session of the Security Council scheduled?" 1100 hours, ma'am. Approximately 3 hours from now." "And the probability that they'll decide to surrender?" Chen was quiet for a moment. The analysts put it at roughly 60%. Several major nations are pushing for capitulation, arguing that resistance is futile and will only lead to greater suffering.
What do you think, James?
The question seemed to catch him off guard. In their 5 years of service together, Admiral Vasquez had rarely asked for his personal opinion on strategic matters. I think, he hesitated, then squared his shoulders. I think those nations are looking at the numbers and seeing a mathematical equation, 17,000 versus 300, an impossible gap. They're thinking like accountants.
And you?
I'm thinking like a human being, ma'am. I'm thinking about what happens after we surrender, about what harvest means, about why they'd encourage resistance if it wasn't somehow beneficial to them. His voice hardened. And I'm thinking about my daughter, who's 8 years old and just learned to ride a bicycle last week, about whether I want her to grow up, or whatever the alternative is, in a universe where humanity laid down and died without throwing a single punch.
Helena smiled, though there was no warmth in it. The Cathari made a mistake, Commander.
Ma'am, they told us that resistance would make them stronger. They assumed that information would terrify us into submission. She turned away from the viewport entirely, her expression hardening into something that had made enemies underestimate her throughout her career. They don't understand humans at all.
The emergency session of the United Nations Security Council was held in a bunker 300 meters beneath Geneva. The original UN headquarters in New York had been deemed too vulnerable, not that anywhere on Earth was truly safe anymore, and the Swiss facility offered the most advanced communications array available.
Secretary General Antonio Reyes sat at the head of the massive circular table, his face lined with exhaustion and the weight of a decision no human leader had ever been forced to make. Around him sat the representatives of every major nation, their holographic displays flickering with real-time updates from the fleet overhead.
"We will now hear from the representative of the Russian Federation," Reyes said, his voice steady despite everything.
President Dmitry Volkov stood, his broad shoulders seeming to carry the burden of his nation's entire history. "We have analyzed the tactical situation thoroughly. Our military experts, working in conjunction with those of our allies, have concluded that conventional resistance against the Cathari fleet is impossible. Their vessels outgun our most powerful warships by a factor of at least 10 to 1, based on the sensor readings we've obtained." Then you support capitulation? The question came from Prime Minister Yuki Tanaka of Japan, her tone carefully neutral.
"I did not say that." Volkov's eye swept the room. "I said conventional resistance is impossible. Russia has not survived for 1,000 years by accepting impossibility. We have reached out to our Chinese colleagues with a proposal." President Wei Mingzhu rose as Volkov sat. "The People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation have jointly developed a plan. It is not without risk. Indeed, it may be the most dangerous gamble in human history, but we believe it offers our only hope for survival." Reyes leaned forward. "What plan?"
"We propose a first strike," Wei said simply, and the room erupted.
It took nearly 5 minutes for order to be restored, during which time the American president, the British Prime Minister, and the French president all demanded the floor simultaneously. When quiet finally returned, it was Helena Vasquez who spoke, her holographic image projected from the Prometheus.
If I may, Secretary General?
Reyes nodded, perhaps grateful for a voice of military authority in the chaos. "Admiral Vasquez, please." "Thank you." Helena's image stood, though she was actually still seated in her command chair light minutes away. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have spent the past 48 hours analyzing the Cathari fleet with every sensor at our disposal. I have consulted with military strategists from every nation, with physicists who understand their propulsion systems, and with psychologists who have attempted to model their behavior. And I have reached a conclusion that I believe Presidents Volkov and Wei have independently arrived at." She paused, letting the tension build. "We cannot win a defensive war. The Cathari have positioned themselves to strike at any point on Earth or in Earth orbit with overwhelming force. They can concentrate their fleet against any target,
while we are forced to spread our defenses across an entire planet. Any passive defense we attempt will be whittled down over time until nothing remains.
Then what do you suggest? President Morrison of the United States asked.
We attack, not defensively, not reactively, but with everything we have in a coordinated first strike designed to cause maximum damage before they can respond.
That's suicide, Prime Minister Harrison of Britain said flatly. We'd be throwing away our entire fleet.
Our fleet is dead anyway, Prime Minister. Either it dies in a week when they finish positioning for their harvest, or it dies in an hour achieving something meaningful. The question is what we buy with those deaths.
And what would we buy, Admiral? Secretary General Reyes asked quietly.
Helena's holographic form turned to face a display that appeared beside her, a tactical representation of the Cathari formation. Their fleet is arranged in a sphere, as you can see. It's geometrically perfect, which tells us something important about Cathari psychology. They value order, precision, mathematical purity. They have positioned themselves for maximum coverage of all possible human escape vectors.
Which means they're everywhere, Harrison pointed out.
Which means they're spread thin, Helena countered. 17,000 ships to cover a sphere with a surface area of roughly 1 trillion square kilometers. They're arranged in clusters of approximately 50 vessels each, with significant gaps between clusters.
Even 50 ships against our entire fleet would be a slaughter, yes, if we attack 50 ships with our entire fleet. But that's not what I'm proposing. Helena manipulated the display, and suddenly the sphere zoomed in on a particular section. Here, this cluster isn't 50 ships, it's over 300, the densest concentration in the entire formation.
Their command center? Wei asked, leaning forward.
We believe so. The energy signatures from this cluster are distinct from the others. More powerful reactors, more communication traffic, a subtly different geometric arrangement that suggests vessels of higher importance. Helena's eyes were cold. I'm proposing we hit them there, hard, with everything we have, including weapons that several nations have officially denied possessing.
The room went very quiet. You're talking about nuclear weapons, President Morrison said finally. In space.
I'm talking about survival, Madam President. The Outer Space Treaty has served us well for a century, but I think we can agree the situation has changed.
Even if we used nuclear weapons, Prime Minister Tanaka interjected, what makes you think they would have any effect? Alien technology could render them useless.
They could, Helena admitted, but our analysis suggests otherwise. The Cathari vessels, despite their advanced propulsion systems, use physical armor rather than energy shields. Their hulls are incredibly dense, some kind of metallic alloy we don't recognize, but they're still physical matter, and nothing we know of can survive a direct nuclear detonation.
You're betting the fate of humanity on that assumption, Harrison said.
Yes, Prime Minister, I am, because the alternative is certain death.
The debate continued for another 3 hours. Arguments were made, data was analyzed, and more than a few tears were shed. In the end, when the vote was called, it was surprisingly close.
17 nations voted for the first strike. 15 nations voted for continued attempts at negotiation.
Secretary General Reyes sat in silence for a long moment after the final tally was announced. Then he looked directly at Helena's holographic image and spoke the words that would define the next chapter of human history.
Admiral Vasquez, you have authorization to proceed. May God have mercy on us all.
The Prometheus was one of humanity's 12 Titan-class carriers, vessels that had been built over the past decade as the backbone of Earth's nascent space navy. At 800 meters long and capable of carrying 200 smaller combat craft, she represented the pinnacle of human military engineering. She was also, Helena knew, completely inadequate for the task at hand.
Status report, she called out as she strode onto the command deck, which was buzzing with activity.
All vessels report ready for combat operations, Commander Chen replied from his station. Fleet is organized into 5 strike groups as per your specifications. Nuclear payload distribution is complete.
Each group has been allocated weapons based on estimated defensive capabilities.
And the timing? Synchronized to the nanosecond, ma'am. All groups will initiate their attack runs simultaneously, arriving at their targets within a 15-second window. Helena nodded, settling into her command chair. Around her, the massive display screens showed the disposition of humanity's fleet. 347 vessels, ranging from carriers like the Prometheus down to fast-attack corvettes barely 100 meters long. Against the Cathari formation, they looked like insects preparing to assault a mountain range. Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park called from the sensor station. I'm picking up unusual activity in the target cluster. Helena's attention snapped to the main display, which zoomed in on the command cluster they intended to attack. Show me. The image enhanced, and Helena saw it immediately. A subtle rearrangement of the vessels in the cluster, a shift in their geometric pattern that created something new. They're opening a channel in their formation, Park said, her voice tight. They're making room for something. Before Helena could respond, space itself seemed to tear open once again. From the wound in reality emerged a vessel unlike anything the Cathari had displayed before, where their warships were angular and utilitarian. This construct was massive and ornate, covered in what appeared to be crystalline structures that caught and reflected the distant sunlight. "Dimensions?" Helena demanded. 12 kilometers long, ma'am, roughly conical in shape. Energy readings they're off the scale. Whatever that thing is, it's putting out more power than our entire fleet combined. Their flagship, Chen breathed. It has to be. Helena watched the massive vessel settle into the center of the command cluster, surrounded by its escorts like a king protected by its guards. And in that moment, she made a decision that wasn't in any tactical manual. All groups, this is Admiral Vasquez. Tactical update. Target is now designated as the newly arrived vessel. Repeat, all strike groups will concentrate on the crystalline ship. Acknowledge. One by one, the strike group commanders acknowledged, their voices carrying varying degrees of concern at the sudden change of plans. Helena understood their hesitation. They had planned for a specific attack, and she was changing the parameters at the last moment. But something in her gut told her that the arrival of this vessel was significant, and that opportunity wouldn't last. "Admiral," Chen said quietly, leaning close, "are you sure? That ship's defensive capabilities are unknown. If it has countermeasures we haven't anticipated." "Then we'll find out, Commander. But that vessel arrived for a reason. Either it's here to oversee the harvest, or it's here because they detected our preparations. Either way, it's important to them, and anything that important is worth hitting." Chen nodded slowly. "Understood, ma'am. Strike groups report ready." Helena took a deep breath, looking around her command deck at the men and women who had served with her through 3 wars. They were afraid, she could see it in their eyes, but they were also determined. This was what they had trained for, what they had dedicated their lives to. Not this specific scenario, perhaps, but the principle, the defense of Earth against all threats. "Communications," Helena said. "Open a channel to the Cathari fleet." "Ma'am?" The communications officer, Lieutenant Baker, looked startled. "They haven't responded to any of our previous." "They'll respond to this. Open the channel." Baker worked his console, then nodded. "Channel open, ma'am. All frequencies." Helena stood, straightening her uniform with a gesture that was more habitual than necessary. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, projected across the void to the 17,000 vessels that held her world hostage. "Attention, Cathari Fleet. This is Admiral Helena Vasquez of the United Earth ship Prometheus, commanding the combined military forces of humanity. Your message has been received and considered. You offered us the opportunity to resist, encouraging us to make your harvest more efficient. We have a counteroffer." She paused, letting her words hang in the silence of space. "You say you have observed our development and calculated our potential.
You believe you know what we are, what we're capable of, what we will do. You're wrong. You have studied us from afar, but you don't understand us. You don't understand that humans don't fight because we think we can win. We fight because that's what we are. We are the species that crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars.
We are the species that survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and plagues that killed half our population. We are the species that split the atom and decoded the genome and refused to die despite every obstacle the universe put in our path.
Helena's voice hardened, becoming something that would have made her enemies from those 3 wars remember exactly why they had lost.
You want us to resist? You want us to make this interesting for you? Fine, we accept. But know this, whatever you thought you were coming here to harvest, whatever calculations you made about our potential, you got it wrong. You haven't surrounded Earth, you've surrounded yourself with us. And now you're going to learn what happens when humanity decides to fight.
She made a cutting gesture to Baker, who closed the channel.
All strike groups, Helena said, settling back into her command chair. Begin attack runs. Authorization code, First Light. Humanity stands with you. Make it count.
The attack commenced at precisely 14:37 hours Greenwich Mean Time.
From 5 different vectors, humanity's fleet surged toward the Cathari command cluster like a handful of thrown stones. Each strike group had been assigned a specific approach angle, designed to split the defenders' attention and create gaps in their response.
Strike Group Alpha, led by the carrier Alexander the Great, approached from the ecliptic plane. Strike Group Beta, under the command of the Sun Tzu, drove in from above. Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon completed the assault from below and the flanks.
The Prometheus led Strike Group Alpha, and Helena watched the tactical display with the focused attention of a lifetime of combat experience. The range closed rapidly. 300,000 kilometers, 200,000, 100,000.
Enemy vessels responding, Lieutenant Commander Park reported. Approximately 80 ships from the outer perimeter are moving to intercept. They're fast, faster than our projections suggested.
Adjust course to minimize intercept window, Helena ordered. All ships prepare for defensive maneuvers.
The Cathari interceptors were terrifying in their speed and precision. They moved in perfect formation, their angular hulls cutting through space like blades. As they closed to engagement range, they opened fire.
Helena had never seen anything like the weapons the Cathari employed. Beams of something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite plasma lanced out from their vessels, tracking human ships with impossible accuracy. In the first 5 seconds of combat, humanity lost 12 vessels, vaporized so completely that not even debris remained.
Evasive action, all ships, Helena barked. Return fire at will.
Human weapons were primitive by comparison. Railgun slugs and missile salvos, and the occasional directed energy weapon that represented decades of research. But they had one advantage: sheer volume. Every human ship carried far more weapons than its individual power systems could efficiently support, a design philosophy born from humanity's long experience with asymmetric warfare.
A Cathari interceptor took a railgun slug directly through its central mass and crumpled like a crushed insect. Another absorbed 3 missile impacts before its hull breached, spilling atmosphere and unidentifiable debris into the void. A third was hit by a concentrated beam from the Alexander the Great's main battery and burned for long seconds before its reactor failed.
"We're hurting them," someone on the bridge shouted, and for a moment Helena allowed herself to hope. Then the command cluster responded.
It was like watching a flower of death unfold. The 300 vessels surrounding the crystalline flagship oriented themselves toward the incoming strike groups and began firing in coordinated waves. The space between fleets became a lethal maze of crisscrossing beams, and human vessels died by the dozen.
The Alexander the Great was hit amidships, her carrier section torn open and her fighter bays venting atmosphere.
Her captain managed to fire the main guns one last time before a secondary hit took out her reactor, and the old ship vanished in a brief new sun.
Strike Group Alpha reports 37% casualties, Chen reported, his voice strained but controlled. Beta is at 42%. Gamma has been combat ineffective.
"Keep going, Helena," ordered. "All remaining vessels, maximum acceleration. Get in close, inside their firing solutions."
It was a desperate gamble. The Cathari beam weapons were devastating at range, but seemed to have minimum engagement distances. The ships needed to orient themselves to fire, and at close quarters, their movements became a liability. Human vessels, smaller and more maneuverable, could potentially exploit that weakness. The Prometheus shuddered as a glancing blow vaporized her forward sensor array. Helena gripped her armrests, watching the range continue to close. 50,000 kilometers, Park called out. 40, 30.
Nuclear weapon release on my mark, Helena said. All ships, stand by.
The crystalline flagship loomed ahead, impossibly large, its surface crawling with energy patterns that hurt to look at directly. Around it, Cathari warships struggled to reorient themselves to face the suicide charge of the human fleet. Many succeeded, killing more human vessels with clinical precision. Many did not. 20,000 kilometers. 15. 10.
Mark, Helena said. Fire everything.
Across what remained of the human fleet, a mere 112 vessels from the original 347, nuclear weapons launched. They were housed in missiles and bombs and jury-rigged torpedoes, representing every nation's stockpile and every classification of yield from tactical to strategic.
387 nuclear weapons hurtled toward the Cathari command cluster. The alien fleet's point defense systems, finally responding to the threat, began picking them off, but there were too many, coming from too many directions, moving too fast. The first detonation occurred within a kilometer of a Cathari cruiser. The flash was brief and brilliant, and when it faded, the cruiser was gone, along with two of its neighbors. More detonations followed, each one a miniature sun born and dead in the same instant.
But it was the flagship that drew the main attack. Humanity's targeting systems, linked across the surviving fleet, had designated the crystalline vessel as Priority 1. 63 nuclear weapons, many of them enhanced with experimental elements, converged on the massive alien ship. The flagship's defenses were impressive. Energy shields, shields that Helena's analysts had sworn the Cathari didn't possess, snapped into existence, catching detonation after detonation in brilliant flares of light. But the shields were designed for sustained combat, not overwhelming assault. Each nuclear impact weakened them, drained them, pushed them closer to failure.
The 47th weapon to reach the flagship found a gap.
The enhanced thermonuclear warhead detonated against the crystalline hull, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then cracks began to spread across the ship's surface, racing through the crystalline structures like lightning frozen in time. Secondary explosions followed as internal systems failed, and then the flagship simply came apart, its pieces scattering outward in a cloud of glittering debris.
On the bridge of the Prometheus, someone began to cheer. Others joined in, and for a brief moment, the horror of their losses was forgotten in the shock of their victory. Then the rest of the Cathari fleet began to move. "All ships, fall back," Helena ordered, but she knew it was already too late. The destruction of the flagship had triggered something in the Cathari fleet. The perfect geometric formation that had surrounded Earth began to collapse inward, thousands of vessels converging on the remains of the command cluster. Their fire, which had been methodical and precise, became something else, something that looked almost like rage. "Admiral, we've lost contact with strike groups Beta and Delta," Chen reported, his voice cracking. "Epsilon is reporting total losses. It's just us and the remnants of Alpha." Helena stared at the tactical display, watching the swarm of Cathari vessels close in. 34 human ships remained, 34 out of 347.
They had destroyed perhaps 200 enemy vessels, including the flagship, but the cost had been unimaginable.
Ma'am, Lieutenant Baker said, we're receiving a transmission. I think it's coming from the flagship debris.
Put it through.
The voice that emerged from the speakers was not what Helena had expected. It was not cold or mechanical or alien in the way she had imagined. Instead, it was almost pleased. Humanity, you have demonstrated unexpected capability. The parameters of the harvest have been recalculated. Recalculated how? Helena demanded, though she knew she might not get an answer. Initial assessment indicated a species of limited potential, isolated development, primitive technology, behavioral patterns suggesting limited adaptability. This assessment was incorrect.
Helena exchanged a look with Chen. You're saying you underestimated us?
We are saying your species is of greater value than anticipated. The harvest will be modified. Your genetic material, your behavioral patterns, your capacity for what you call inspiration, these are of interest. The harvest will be more comprehensive.
The word comprehensive hung in the air like a death sentence.
We destroyed your flagship, Helena said. We've proven we can hurt you.
You have. This is valuable data. It demonstrates that humanity can be dangerous when threatened, a trait we wish to incorporate. The harvest will proceed, and humanity's resistance will make the incorporation more complete. The transmission ended, and Helena felt something cold settle into her stomach. They hadn't won anything. They had simply proven themselves valuable enough to warrant a more thorough exploitation.
Ma'am, Park said, the enemy formation is stabilizing. They're not attacking.
Helena looked at the display and saw it was true. The converging Cathari vessels had stopped their advance, holding position at a distance of roughly 10,000 kilometers. They had the human survivors surrounded, but they weren't firing.
They're waiting, she realized. They want something. Maybe they want us to surrender, Chen suggested. After that display, they might expect.
No. Helena stood, pacing the length of the bridge. They said the harvest would proceed. They're not waiting for surrender. They're waiting for something else, something they need.
Her eyes fell on the display, specifically on the expanded view of the flagship debris, and there, amid the glittering fragments of crystalline hull, she saw something.
Park, magnify section 7 alpha.
The image enhanced, and Helena's breath caught. Amid the debris floated a structure, smaller than the flagship, but still massive, roughly 2 kilometers long. It was clearly damaged, listing slightly and venting atmosphere, but it was intact. That's not a ship, Chen said, studying the image. The configuration is all wrong. Look at the external structures. Those are docking clamps, hundreds of them.
It's a transport, Helena said. They came here to harvest us, which means they came here to take us somewhere. That's the vessel they plan to use. Her mind raced.
Putting pieces together. That's why they're waiting. Their transport is damaged, and they can't proceed with the harvest until it's repaired.
Ma'am, are you saying we have leverage?
Helena turned to face her crew, and something fierce blazed in her eyes. I'm saying we have a target. Communications. Open a channel to Earth Command. Priority Alpha. The response from Earth was immediate and overwhelming. Word of the first strike's partial success, the destruction of the flagship and 200 enemy vessels, had spread across the globe within minutes. Combined with footage of the crystalline ship's death, captured by surviving vessels and transmitted home, it had ignited something in the human spirit that decades of comfortable peacetime had nearly extinguished. Now, as Helena watched through the Prometheus's viewports, the evidence of that awakening approached.
Civilian transport Mayflower is in position, Commander Chen reported. She's carrying 1,200 volunteers from the North American continent. Another 6 transports are inbound with volunteers from Europe,
Asia, and Africa.
Armament? Improvised at best. Industrial lasers, mining charges, and personal weapons. But Admiral, these people aren't here to fight.
Helena nodded slowly. I know, Commander. They're here to die.
The plan that had emerged from the emergency strategy session was brutal in its simplicity. The Cathari needed their transport vessel to carry out the harvest. It was the bottleneck in their operation, the critical point of failure. As long as that vessel existed, humanity was in danger. Therefore, the vessel had to be destroyed.
But the human fleet no longer had the capacity to mount another assault. Their remaining 34 warships were barely functional, with depleted weapon systems and skeletal crews. Against the still formidable Cathari fleet, they would be annihilated before getting within weapons range.
The civilian volunteers offered another option.
7,000 men and women from across Earth had answered the call in the hours since the first strike. They had boarded civilian transports, passenger liners, cargo haulers, even a few private yachts, and headed into space. None of them were soldiers. None of them had any expectation of survival.
They had come to die so that humanity might live.
Admiral, Lieutenant Baker said, President Morrison is on the line. Helena gestured for the connection, and the American president's face appeared on a secondary display. She looked as exhausted as Helena felt, dark circles under her eyes and gray streaking her formerly dark hair.
Admiral Vasquez, I wanted to speak with you before it begins.
Madam President.
I know we're asking the impossible. These volunteers... Morrison paused, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. They know they won't come back. Many of them have families, children. They're sacrificing everything.
They understand what's at stake, ma'am. Do they? Do we? The president's voice cracked slightly. We're sending 7,000 civilians to their deaths on the hope that they can destroy one ship. If this fails,
then the Cathari will proceed with the harvest, and humanity as we know it will cease to exist. Helena met the president's eyes through the display, and her voice was as steady as stone. These volunteers understand that, Madam President. They've seen the alien message. They know what harvest means. Not just death, but absorption, incorporation, the erasure of everything that makes us human. They're not sacrificing themselves for a chance.
They're sacrificing themselves because there is no alternative.
Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had found its own strength. Give them every chance you can, Admiral. And when this is over, if we're still here to remember, make sure the world knows what they did.
I will, Madam President. Vasquez out.
The connection closed, and Helena turned her attention back to the tactical display. The civilian transports were now in position, forming a rough wedge aimed at the Cathari formation. Mixed among them were the surviving military vessels, their job to provide covering fire and draw attention while the civilians closed the distance.
The Cathari are responding, Park reported. Their formation is tightening around the transport vessel. They know what we're planning.
Helena studied the display, watching the enemy rearrangement. The aliens were concentrating their defenses, creating a wall of warships between the human forces and the damaged transport. It was exactly what she had expected.
Lieutenant Baker, open a channel to the Mayflower.
Channel open, man.
This is Admiral Vasquez to all civilian vessels. In a few minutes, you're going to be asked to do something that no one should ever have to do. You're going to fly into the teeth of an alien fleet, knowing that most of you won't survive. I wish I could tell you that your sacrifice will guarantee victory. I can't. What I can tell you is that you represent everything that makes humanity worth saving.
She paused, looking at the display showing the faces of the volunteers, men and women of every age and nationality, fear in their eyes, but determination in their set jaws and squared shoulders.
The Cathari came here expecting to harvest us like cattle. They thought we would surrender, or if we thought, that we would be easy to defeat. They were wrong.
The first strike proved that humanity doesn't go quietly. Now you're going to prove that we never stop fighting, never stop reaching, never accept defeat. Whatever happens today, the universe will remember that humans faced extinction and chose to stand.
Helena drew a deep breath. All vessels, this is Admiral Vasquez. Begin attack run. Codename Last Light. May we meet again on the other side.
The Battle of Last Light, as it would come to be known, began at 1847 hours Greenwich Mean Time.
The civilian transports accelerated toward the Cathari Formation at their maximum speed, which was a fraction of what military vessels could achieve. They were slow, unarmored, and effectively unarmed. They were perfect targets.
And that was exactly the point. Cathari weapons are firing, Park reported. They're focusing on the civilian transports as predicted. Helena watched as alien beams lanced out, spearing the lead transport, a converted passenger liner called Hope of Earth, and vaporizing it instantly. 300 people died in that first instant, their lives ending so quickly they probably never even knew what happened. More beams followed, and more transports died. The Mayflower took a glancing hit that tore away her starboard hull, killing dozens and leaving the rest to suffocate in vacuum. A cargo hauler named Second Chance was hit by 3 beams simultaneously and simply ceased to exist.
But the transports kept coming. For every one that died, 2 more pressed forward. The volunteers aboard them watched their friends die and did not turn back. They accelerated harder, pushing their aging engines to the breaking point, their eyes fixed on the Cathari transport in the distance.
Military vessels engaging, Commander Chen reported. We're drawing fire away from the civilians.
The Prometheus shuddered as her main railguns fired, sending hypersonic slugs toward the nearest Cathari warships. The aliens responded with devastating accuracy, and Helena felt the deck lurch beneath her as multiple hits struck the carrier's armored hull.
Damage report. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Reactor containment holding, but stressed. We've lost forward weapons batteries and the main sensor array. Helena gripped her armrests as another impact rocked the ship. On the tactical display, she watched her fleet die. The Invincible took a direct hit to her reactor and vanished in nuclear fire. The Defiant was cut in half by a sustained beam that burned through her central axis. The Steadfast lasted longest, her captain using the dying ship as a ramming weapon that crushed a Cathari cruiser before both vessels exploded. But the civilian transports were still closing.
The Cathari, for all their technological superiority, had made a tactical error. They had concentrated their fleet around the damaged transport, creating a dense formation that maximized their defensive firepower. But it also meant that their ships were too close together to maneuver freely, and the civilian transports, moving on courses that were simply straight lines toward the target, were harder to intercept than they should have been.
Civilian transports entering close range, Park said, her voice tight with emotion. 12 vessels remaining. Helena watched as the ragged survivors of the civilian fleet reached the Cathari Formation. Some were destroyed in the final moments before impact. Others managed to slip through gaps in the enemy fire, their hulls burning but their engines still functional. The first impact occurred when the transport New York struck a Cathari cruiser at relativistic speed. Both vessels vanished in a flash of light that momentarily overwhelmed the Prometheus's sensors. 3 more civilian ships followed, smashing into alien warships and dying in fire.
But 6 transports made it through.
They weren't carrying weapons in the conventional sense. They were carrying something far more dangerous, industrial mining equipment, loaded with every nuclear device that humanity had been able to gather in the past 6 hours. The Mayflower, somehow still flying despite having lost half her hull, was the first to reach the Cathari transport. She struck the massive vessel's docking section at full speed, her reactor going critical at the moment of impact. The nuclear devices she carried detonated simultaneously, creating a firestorm that tore through the transport's already damaged hull. More civilian ships followed, each one adding to the destruction.
The Cathari transport, designed to carry captured populations across interstellar distances, was never meant to withstand this kind of assault. Its armor, impressive as it was, couldn't hold against the continuous barrage of nuclear fire.
From the bridge of the dying Prometheus, Helena watched as the transport broke apart. Its hull cracked like an egg, spilling components and atmosphere into space. Secondary explosions raced through its internal structure as systems failed and reactors overloaded. Within minutes, the massive vessel was reduced to scattered debris.
"It's done," Chen said, his voice barely a whisper. "They did it." Helena nodded slowly, but she didn't feel victory. All around her, the evidence of humanity's sacrifice burned in the void. 1,700 civilians had died in the final attack. 312 military personnel had died aboard the fleet's vessels. Combined with the losses from the first strike, nearly 8,000 humans had given their lives. And the Cathari fleet still surrounded Earth. "Admiral," Lieutenant Baker said, "we're receiving another transmission. It's coming from the entire fleet simultaneously." Helena straightened in her chair, ignoring the pain from injuries she hadn't noticed receiving. Put it through. The voice that emerged was different from before, deeper, more resonant, carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate in the bones. "Humanity, you have surprised us."
"We're full of surprises," Helena replied, her voice steady despite everything. "What happens now?"
"You have destroyed our harvest transport. You have killed our prime commander. You have demonstrated capabilities beyond our calculations." A pause. "We have existed for 4 billion years. We have harvested 10,000 species. None have resisted as you have."
Is that supposed to impress us?
It is supposed to explain what happens next. We had intended to harvest humanity, to incorporate your genetic material and behavioral patterns into our collective. That plan is no longer viable. Helena felt her heart rate increase. "What do you mean?" "A species capable of what you have demonstrated cannot be safely incorporated. Your resistance protocols, your capacity for self-sacrifice, your willingness to die rather than accept subjugation, these traits would corrupt our collective. We would become something we are not." Around Helena, the bridge crew exchanged confused looks. Was the enemy saying what it seemed to be saying? "We will not harvest humanity. But neither can we allow humanity to exist as a threat. Your species has proven too dangerous for either option." The alien fleet began to move again, and Helena saw with horror that they were converging on Earth itself. "If we cannot incorporate you, we will eliminate you. It is the only logical conclusion. Prepare for extinction." The next 6 hours were the darkest in human history. The Cathari fleet descended on Earth like a swarm of locusts, their weapons turning on the planet's surface. Cities burned, coastlines were vaporized. The orbital defense platforms that humanity had hoped would provide some protection were destroyed in the opening minutes. From the crippled Prometheus, Helena watched as her home world died. "Admiral, we have to do something," Commander Chen said, his voice breaking. On the display, they could see the western coast of North America vanishing under a curtain of alien fire. "There must be something." "There's nothing," Helena said. The words felt like ash in her mouth. "We have 2 functioning weapons batteries and barely enough fuel to maintain orbit. Our strike was a success, and it killed us anyway." Around them, the few surviving human vessels drifted in the void, too damaged to fight, too crippled to flee. They were forced to watch as the Cathari systematically destroyed everything they had ever known. Then something changed. "Admiral," Lieutenant Commander Park said, her voice strange, "I'm picking up new energy signatures, coming from... I don't know where they're coming from." Helena turned to the sensor display, and her breath caught.
New contacts were appearing, not from any direction she recognized, but seeming to materialize out of nowhere. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, thousands of them, surrounding the Cathari fleet, just as the Cathari had surrounded Earth.
What the hell? Jem breathed.
The new vessels were like nothing Helena had ever seen. They were elegant where the Cathari were angular, flowing where the aliens were rigid. They seemed to glow with internal light, and their dimensions were somehow difficult to focus on, as if they existed only partially in normal space.
"We're being hailed," Baker reported. Admiral, it's not coming from the Cathari."
Put it through. The voice that emerged was musical, almost melodic, and it spoke in perfect English.
"Humanity, we are the collective consciousness of the Andromeda Alliance. We have observed your struggle with interest. Your resistance has been unexpected, impressive. A species that willingly sacrifices itself to protect its people is rare in this universe."
"Who are you?" Helena demanded, "and why are you here?"
"We are ancient enemies of the Cathari. For 4 billion years, they have expanded across the cosmos, consuming species after species. We have fought them where we could, but their numbers were always too great. Until now." The new vessels opened fire on the Cathari fleet, and the difference was immediately apparent. Where humanity's weapons had struggled to damage alien hulls, the Alliance's weapons tore through them like paper. Cathari ships exploded by the dozen, then by the 100. Your resistance weakened them more than you know. The loss of their prime commander disrupted their collective consciousness. The destruction of their harvest transport eliminated their ability to reinforce. You did not merely fight back. You crippled them at the moment of their greatest vulnerability.
Helena watched in disbelief as the Cathari fleet, the same fleet that had seemed invincible hours ago, was systematically destroyed. The aliens tried to fight back, tried to flee, but the Alliance vessels were everywhere, cutting off escape routes and delivering devastating fire.
"We have waited millennia for this moment. We could not attack the Cathari directly. Their numbers were too great, and a direct assault would have unified them against us. But you attacked from within, disrupted their hierarchy, created chaos in their ranks. You gave us the opening we needed."
The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. When it was over, the Cathari fleet had been reduced to debris. Not a single enemy vessel remained functional. Earth, battered and burning, was free.
"Humanity," the Alliance voice said, "we offer you membership in our collective consciousness. Your species has proven its worth. You would be valued allies in the ongoing struggle against threats like the Cathari."
Helena looked at her crew, at the faces of men and women who had thought they were going to die. She thought about the 1,700 civilians who had sacrificed themselves in the final attack, the 312 military personnel, the millions on Earth who had died in the bombardment.
"We'll need to discuss your offer," she said finally. "But first, we have a lot of rebuilding to do."
"We understand. We will remain in orbit to assist with recovery efforts. Your world is damaged but not destroyed. With assistance, it can be restored."
Helena nodded slowly, then turned to look out the viewport at Earth. Massive fires still burned across several continents, and the atmosphere was thick with smoke and debris. But through the haze, she could see sunlight breaking through, the first dawn of a new age for humanity.
"Commander Chen," she said, "open a channel to whatever's left of Earth Command. Tell them it's over. Tell them we won." Epilogue. 1 year later.
The ceremony was held in the rebuilt plaza of what had once been Geneva. The city was still a work in progress. Scaffolding covered half the buildings, and construction drones filled the sky. But the plaza itself had been restored to something approaching its former glory.
Admiral Helena Vasquez stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of thousands who had gathered to witness the unveiling. Behind her, shrouded in fabric,
stood the monument that would commemorate the Battle of Last Light.
1 year ago, she began, her voice carried by speakers to the farthest edges of the crowd, humanity faced extinction. An enemy we couldn't defeat surrounded our world and demanded that we surrender. We refused.
She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembly. When I gave the order for the first strike, I knew we couldn't win. The mathematics were clear. 17,000 enemy vessels against our 300. But I also knew that humanity has never been defined by mathematics. We're defined by our refusal to accept the impossible, our determination to keep fighting no matter the odds, our willingness to sacrifice everything for those we love. Helena turned to gesture at the shrouded monument. The men and women we honor today understood that. They boarded civilian transports knowing they wouldn't come back. They flew into the heart of an alien fleet knowing they would die. And in their deaths, they bought us something we had no right to expect: victory. She stepped back as the fabric fell away, revealing the monument beneath. It was a simple design, a column of white stone bearing the names of every person who had died in the 2 battles, from the first strike against the command cluster to the final assault on the transport. Nearly 9,000 names covered the column from base to summit.
At the top stood a sculpture, a human figure, arms raised toward the sky, face turned upward with an expression of defiance and hope.
The Andromeda Alliance has called us heroes, Helena said. They say we demonstrated something rare in the universe, a species willing to sacrifice itself for the greater good. But I think they missed the point. We didn't sacrifice ourselves for the greater good. We sacrificed ourselves for each other, for our families, our friends, our children, for the people standing next to us, and the people we would never meet.
She looked out at the crowd, seeing faces of every age and nationality, and felt something that had been missing for the past year finally settle into place.
That's what makes humanity special. Not our technology, not our weapons, not our tactical brilliance. Our willingness to stand together when everything seems lost. The Cathari came to harvest us because they saw potential in our species. They were right. There is potential in humanity, but it's not the kind they could have incorporated. It's the kind that fights back, the kind that never surrenders.
The kind that opens the first strike when surrounded by overwhelming force and somehow finds a way to win. Helena stepped away from the podium, her speech complete. Around her, the crowd began to cheer, tentatively at first, then building to a roar that echoed off the surrounding buildings.
Humanity had survived, scarred, damaged, changed, but alive. And in the years to come, as they rebuilt their world and took their place among the civilizations of the galaxy, they would carry with them the lesson of last light.
When facing the impossible, humanity doesn't calculate the odds. It fights. In the decades that followed, the human race expanded beyond Earth for the first time in earnest. Colonies spread to Mars, to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and eventually to worlds orbiting distant stars. The Andromeda Alliance provided technology and guidance, but it was human determination that drove the expansion, the same determination that had destroyed the Cathari harvest transport.
Admiral Helena Vasquez retired 5 years after the Battle of Last Light, having overseen the reconstruction of Earth's military forces. She spent her final years writing a history of the First Interstellar War, a book that became required reading at military academies across the galaxy.
Her final words, recorded on her deathbed at the age of 91, became legendary. They asked me once why I ordered the first strike when the odds were so impossible. I told them the truth, because the alternative was to watch humanity die without a fight. That was never an option. It never will be. We are humans. We throw punches at gods and shake our fists at the void. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe flinches first.